This is a neuroanatomy video. In terms of neuroanatomy, we're going to study the brainstem, but we're going to be looking at the lumps and bumps. We're going to be looking at the external features. We'll talk about the three different parts of the brainstem. We'll have a we will talk about what they do, what they're involved in, and we'll talk about the cranial nerves that come out of here, very, very briefly, all right? Just a nod to the cranial nerves. And we'll talk about the blood supply, and that's it. I'm not going to look inside the brainstem and talk about it in any detail, right? To talk about the structure of the brainstem in detail, you have to cut slices through it and look at all the nuclei and the tracts and we'll do that another day maybe. Okay, there's the plan. If you've seen my videos before, you'll know that it's not that I'm not a fan of neuroanatomy and neuroscience, because I am. It's really, really interesting. It's just that historically I found it very, very difficult. As a teacher, that's maybe handy because I remember some of those difficulties. I've had to overcome them myself, so I can present things in a certain way that maybe make it easier for you guys. Also means I'm not an expert. Oh, I'll let you into a little secret about that. University lecturers often get asked to teach topics that they're not experts in. Don't tell anybody, right? It's a common question I get asked by students. They say, what actually is the brainstem? Like, they're expected to know what the brainstem is. They've got an idea, but what exactly is the brainstem? So that is the question I'm going to address. After this video, you'll be able to tell everybody confidently what the brainstem is, all right? Now, conceptually, right? This model's great, but it falls apart. So this is the cerebrum. This is the cerebellum back here. And this stalk then is the brainstem. And of course it's leading to the spinal cord, which continues down here. So in one very big sense, the brainstem is linking the higher centers, the diencephalon and the cerebellum, with the spinal cord, but there's a lot more to it in that in terms of linking, and we'll meet that as we go. But importantly, the brainstem is often considered the very old centre of the brain, the very old part of the brain. In us humans, this big bit on the top has got really, really big, and we've developed consciousness and all sorts of funky stuff, right? But in the brainstem, we've got centres that regulate consciousness. And very basic homeostatic functions, including things like respiration, control of breathing and that sort of thing, which means that damage to the brainstem can have profound effects, but also is often fatal. So of course damage to the brainstem then can lead to loss of consciousness and to a permanent loss of consciousness. And damage to the brainstem means you can't control your own breathing anymore, so you can't breathe on your own and that sort of thing. So we've got some very old homeostatic centres in here, very, very fundamental things regulating all sorts of cool stuff, but they do link to many other parts of the brain. And that's another thing about neuroanatomy and neuroscience, isn't it? It's very difficult to look at one bit in isolation. Like, we can look at biceps brachii and say it does this, but if you can't really look at just one bit of the brain and say it does this, because everything does lots of stuff and it's all linked together. That's one of the reasons it's so complicated. Right, the brainstem is made up of three parts. Two of the parts we can see easily, and one of the parts kind of needs us to use our imaginations a little bit, which is part of the problem. So we've got the midbrain, that's the most superior part. We've got the pons, which has a very distinctive bulge, and we've got the medulla oblongata, which often just gets referred to as the medulla. And then from the medulla oblongata continues the spinal cord. Should we start at the top and work our way down? Right, well, if I take this apart, does it make my life easier? Kind of, right. So if we take the brain apart, this is the brain stem here, right? This is the brain stem, and it's this part here. So in the centre here, this is the diencephalon. The diencephalon's made up of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. It's a very central bit. And then the cerebrum is the big folded bit around the outside, right? You guys know all about that. So the midbrain is linking to the diencephalon directly, and it's sending out two cerebral peduncles, like stalks, connecting stalks, out to the cerebrum, right? This is why you've got to imagine it a little bit, because it's doing that, but it's the rest of the cerebrum has folded over it, so it gets really difficult to see. So it's not just like a chunk, it's a, right? So that's the midbrain. So the midbrain then is connecting lots of things together. The cerebellum is also attached to the midbrain by the superior peduncles, superior cerebellar peduncles. Don't mix those up. Superior cerebellar peduncles and cerebral peduncles up to the cerebrum. And the cerebellum is actually attached to each of the three parts of the brainstem. Inside the midbrain, I think the most obvious physical feature, if we're talking about physical things, which we are today, is the tube, the aqueduct, the canal running down it. So you know that the brain is bathed in cerebrospinal fluid, and there are a number of ventricles inside the brain. So CSF is produced in there, and it flows out through the other ventricles and what have you, out to bathe the brain, and also the spinal cord, right? There's another video on that. This space here, centrally, is the third ventricle. And then we have this cerebral aqueduct, or aqueduct of Sylvius, connecting the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle, this space down here. So in the midbrain, we have this cerebral aqueduct. This separates the midbrain into two parts. There's this part posteriorly, which is the tectum, and this part anteriorly, which is the tegmentum, which, as you can see, looks much more continuous with the rest of the stuff anteriorly. If you've got to remember, this is in 3D. That canal is a tube running through it, right? Now, if I take the cerebellum off, we can see a couple of little lumps, a couple of little hillocks back here. And this is a really good example of what is important in the midbrain and what's going on in the midbrain. These little lumps, these little hillocks, get called the colliculi. Is that Latin? I think that's Latin for meaning a small hill. So there are two hillocks on either side. We have the two superior colliculi and the two inferior colliculi. Now, we've got 4 hillocks in total then. So these also get called the corpora quadrigemina, which is one of my favourite terms in neuroanatomy, right? Corpora, corpus, body, quad, 4, Gemini, twins. Isn't that lovely? Corpora quadrigemina. So the 4 twinned bodies. The reason these are cool is that the superior colliculi are associated with the visual cortex and the visual stuff and the visual pathways, and also the cerebellum, right? Cerebellum, this bit back here, is a jigsaw puzzle. The cerebellum, it's involved in movement, coordination of movement. It has effects upon movement. It's involved in movement stuff, right? And your eyes, you think you know what you're looking at. Well, you don't know what you're looking at. Your eyes move around. If you look at somebody's face, particularly a new face, you'll look at their eyes and their mouth, and their eyes and their mouth, their eyes and their mouth, eyes, brow, chin, eyes, brow, chin, blah, blah, blah. Your eyes will flick around their face and will build up the features of their face, and you will get a visual impression of what they look like. Those are saccadic eye movements. And it's not just faces, it's lots of other things as well. So what you think you're looking at something, you don't actually have that much control over what you're looking at. It's the same when you're reading a book and your eyes scan along the page, right? And the superior colliculi are like the relays, where the centres coordinating movement and visual stuff all relay, signal box, link together to enable those actions and processing to occur. Isn't that cool, right? Now the inferior colliculi are very similar, but they're involved in auditory stimuli, and they do the same sort of thing, but they seem to be, I think, associated with like neck muscles, maybe upper shoulder muscles, that sort of thing. And the inferior colliculi are what cause you to, if there's a loud bang, cause you to react. You actually work out where that loud bang has come from, and you start turning towards that loud noise before you even realise you've heard it, right? It's a reactive survival mechanism. And again, the relays for that are in the inferior colliculi, linking the cerebellum to the auditory centres and all those other cool things. So you turn towards that potential threat and you're ready for it, right? Means you might survive longer. Evolution. So those are the colliculi, parts of the midbrain. The other things in the midbrain that are famous, there's the red nucleus, which I'm not going to talk about, but there is the substantia nigra. Have you heard of the substantia nigra? In Parkinson's disease, which is a central nervous system, long-term degenerative disorder of movement. If you don't know about Parkinson's disease, look it up, read a bit more about it. But it's in the midbrain that the substantia nigra is a group of cells, dopaminergic neurons, that make dopamine, but then they send that dopamine up through the axons of their neurons to the basal ganglia, other areas of the central nervous system that are important in initiating and regulating movement and things like that. And in Parkinson's disease, those dopaminergic neurons seem to die. Patients have fewer of them, which means there isn't enough dopamine pushed up to the basal ganglia to do the job that dopamine does in terms of movement. That's neuroscience, so I'm stopping there. But that's the important thing. Basal ganglia is in the midbrain part of the brainstem. All right. So those are the cool parts of the midbrain. If we go down to the pons here, the pons is very distinctive. In fact, do you recognise the word pons? Pont? It's this bulge here. So pons means bridge, comes from the Latin word meaning bridge. Hence, the French word pont means bridge as well, right? My French ain't so good anymore. Got schoolboy French, that's about it. This isn't. Let me swap to. We're facing the other way now, we've got the other half, but look, there's the pons there, it's this bulge. But if we follow the cerebral aqueduct down, at the level of the pons, we're starting to get to the fourth ventricle. There's the cerebellum. Now the pons, you can't see it here because of the plane of section, but imagine a stalk sticking out laterally. The pons is connected to the cerebellum by the middle cerebellar peduncle, right? Because we've got, right? Now, it's the shape of the fourth ventricle is actually caused by the peduncles, because we'll see there's an inferior cerebellar peduncle also attaching to the medulla oblongata. So it's these peduncles that are forming the shape of this central space of the fourth ventricle. All right? So the pons then is that distinctive bulge, and you can see the superior margin, the superior edge of the pons and the inferior edge, and that's all pons. And you can see lots of cranial nerves coming out of it. I'm going to come back to that at the end and talk about all the cranial nerves, because we'll just work our way down and list them in one go. Now that's it for pons. Now as we continue inferiorly from the pons, as I said, this is the medulla oblongata. And in the medulla oblongata you can see two ridges. And these ridges are what we call in the central nervous system tracts. If they were outside in the peripheral nervous system, we'd call them nerves. They're bundles of neurons, bundles of axons. And this shows you those bundles of axons that are running up and down the spinal cord to and from the brain. These happen to be running, I think, from the brain down eventually to the muscles. But these are the pyramids, these bulges up here. And we've got this fissure in the middle, which would be the anterior median fissure, separating those two tracts, separating the two pyramids. The two tracts cross over, so those would be the pyramidal decussations. That's where the motor fibres from one side of the brain cross over to the other side of the body, right? That's happening in the pyramidal decussation in the inferior part of the medulla oblongata. Cool, huh? Because you know all about that, now you know where it happens. Almost all of the fibres cross over there, not all of them. Now, if we just look laterally to the pyramids, we see this little blob. This is the olive. There's an olive on either side, and you can see that we've got a bunch of cranial nerves posterior to it and anterior to it. So this is the olive. Inside the olive we have some olivary nuclei. There are inferior and superior olivary nuclei. And again, they're associated with movement stuff and auditory stuff. And as I said, the medulla oblongata is attached to the cerebellum by the inferior cerebellar peduncles. So if it's attached, that means there are neurons running between those two things. That's what the peduncle is. It's a bundle of neurons, right? So the olivary nuclei are involved in auditory stuff and motor stuff again. The rootlets anterior to them are the rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve, I think. Cranial nerve 12, and the rootlets posterior to the olive are the rootlets of cranial nerves 9 and 10, glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagus nerve. So it's very distinctive and stands out like that. All right, so that's it. Midbrain, pons, medulla. You can recognise them now. What about, as we're seeing, the brainstem it's a site where you've got nerves going up and down between the higher centres and the spinal cord and the rest of the body, and we're seeing loads of links with the cerebellum, and we're seeing the cranial nerves arising from this region. It shows you how important a junction box the brainstem is, right? Are you feeling now the brainstem is really important, right? Are you feeling the significance? These shapes and features that we can see on the brainstem are important because they show you that neuroanatomy is a real physical thing. These are physical structures, tracts and neurons and so on. And to a certain extent, well, to a fair old extent, neuroscience is a physical thing as well. All right, so they hopefully give you a visceral sense, excuse the pun, that all those tracts that the neuroscientists talk about, they're real things, real structural things, right? Okay, so how does the brainstem relate to the bones of the skull? Well, that's pretty easy. The skull has got a great big hole in the base of it. The foramen magnum, literally big hole, foramen magnum. And that's how the spinal cord gets into the cranial cavity, right? So the medulla oblongata is here. Now, as we go in to foramen magnum, there's this slope of bone here, the clevus. Is that the Latin word for slope? Something like that. I always remember like ski slope, clevis, ski slope. I don't know, helps me. But it's against this slope of bone that the brainstem is lying. So the medulla, the pons, and then the midbrain are up here. They're lying against this piece of bone, the clevus. All right. This is the posterior cranial fossa, or fossae, because there are two sides to it. That's where the cerebellum sits, and then the cerebrum is up here. Right. Now, what about the blood vessels? The blood vessels relate to this quite importantly. So, if I stick the blood vessels back on this model, the two vertebral arteries are going into the foramen magnum here, and that's what we see on the model. Oh god, here, right? These are the two vertebral arteries on this either side. They're coming together to form the basilar artery, and the basilar artery is running along. You can see the medulla oblongata and the pons and up to the midbrain. Now that means that if the bone is there, that clevus slope, that these blood vessels are between the bone of the clevus inside the skull and the soft tissues of the brainstem. So that's important in terms of trauma and that sort of thing, right? Now, as the basilar artery runs up here, it gives off a number of lateral branches. They get called pontine arteries and circumferential branches and arteries and all sorts. Various arteries are running from the basilar artery across to the pons, which this is just a plastic model, but if we saw in life we'd see lots of little arteries covering the pons and covering the medulla. So that's how the brainstem gets its blood supply. Now the basilar artery ends as the left and right, posterior cerebral arteries, which are going to supply blood to the posterior cerebral bits. But that's at the level of the of the midbrain here. So the midbrain then receives blood from branches from the posterior cerebral arteries. That's the blood supply to the brainstem. The other arteries that we can see here are cerebellar arteries, which are going to run around to the cerebellum. If we were talking about the cerebellum in detail, we'd talk about the arteries in more detail, but essentially you've got superior cerebellar arteries and then inferior cerebellar arteries, and there are posterior and anterior. There's a whole bunch of cerebellar arteries running around to the posterior, right? Posterium? Running around to the posterior. Okay, so foramen magnum, clavus, blood supply. The brain is covered by layers of meninges, right? And the thick dura mater is the thick covering. And we'll talk more about this later, but there's a tent of dura mater separating the cerebellum from the cerebrum, and that's the tentorium cerebelli, which leaves then just a small hole at the top for the brainstem and its arteries to pass through. All right, we'll come back to that in a moment. Now, actually, we don't need the blood vessels anymore. Cranial nerves then. So, cranial nerves 1 and 2 do not come out of the brainstem. They're more extensions of the cerebrum, but all of the other cranial nerves pretty much come out of the brainstem. The spinal accessory nerve has some rootlets from the spinal cord and that sort of thing, but anyway, 1 and 2, forget those. But cranial nerves 3 and 4 come out of the midbrain. Cranial nerves 5, 6, 7 and 8 come out of the pons. Cranial nerves 9, 10, 11 and 12 come out of the medulla oblongata-ish. Some cranial nerves are simpler than other cranial nerves. Some cranial nerves have multiple nuclei, which might be at different levels and what have you, but that's your guide. So this is a big thing in anatomy, right? If you've got this three-dimensional structure and you can imagine where the cranial nerves are coming out of the brainstem, and you can imagine where the brainstem lies in relation to the bones, and you can imagine where the cranial nerves leave the skull via the various foramina, you can then build up this complex three-dimensional thing inside your own mind. So when you're trying to work out what's going on anatomically, pathologically, clinically, if you look at MRI scans and that sort of thing, you can do it, right? That's the difficulty, is taking all these structures and working out where they are spatially. If you can do that, you're doing well. How might you damage the brainstem then, huh? Well, unfortunately, lots of ways. I don't know how old you are. I mean, certainly, do you remember? Oh, they still do it in films, right? In films, a classic trope is a blow to the back of the head there, to the occiput, causes loss of consciousness, right? That's how you quietly knock somebody out. Very bad idea. Don't do it. But why does it knock people out? I mean, this bone back here, super thick. This bone here, around here, super thin. Back here, big, chunky, thick bone. So it's not just bang, I'm banging this part of the brain and they're losing. No. Do you remember I said that there's that dura mater, that thick connective tissue, extending between where the cerebellum is here and the cerebrum, right? It's across there. It's not much better, is it? But running across there. Well, when somebody has a blow to the back of the head, that connective tissue bangs forward into the brainstem, into the midbrain here. So it's likely that tentorium concusses the midbrain, causing loss of consciousness and also likely other problems like, loss of respiratory control and all sorts of things. That's why it's a bad idea. Now, clinically, remember that the skull is made of bone, right? It's important because this means this is an enclosed space inside here. It's not stretchy, it can't expand, and there's already quite a lot of stuff in here. So if you have something going on in here, a bleed, a tumour, a mass of some sort, something that's growing into this space and increasing the pressure inside this space, it means that, so if you've got the connective tissue there, and you've got the small hole there, it means that stuff the pressure, the stuff that's up here gets pushed through this little tiny hole that's like here. It gets pushed through that hole, and then it starts to compress the brainstem, the midbrain, and what have you. Again, causing loss of consciousness, loss of regulation of respiration, and all sorts of other terrible things. So it's terribly, terribly dangerous. This is why intracranial pressure, if it's raised, one of the reasons why it can become dangerous is because brainstem effects. So this would be a herniation of the brain through this gap here. Compressing the midbrain part of the brainstem, and of course compressing the rest of the brainstem. Again, if there's a mass in the posterior cranial fossa here where the cerebellum is, that's going to push forward and again squash the brainstem, which is a bad thing to do. So the take-home message is the brainstem is really important. It's got the three parts of midbrain, pons and medulla, and this is why I harped on about the blood supply. It is somewhat at risk of damage through masses in the cranial cavity and blows to the back of the head. All right? How's that then? If the aim was for you to be able to recognize the parts of the brainstem, describe where the brainstem is and what it does, connects to lots of things, right? It's got tracts right through it, and have that general overview. Can you do that now? Can you describe to somebody else about the brainstem? All right, and hopefully you can link your cranial nerve stuff into it. It's all about adding the building blocks of bits of anatomy and neuroanatomy together, isn't it? So that was an introductory thing. Maybe one day, if I get really brave, we'll look at the inside bits of the brainstem. But that's probably best left to a proper neuroanatomist, not some odd job man like me. Right, see you next week.